welcome to Crown Jewels, a journey through Queen. I am your host, PLD. It has been an exciting time for me. I've been wanting to do this podcast for quite a while, and we're going to just get right into it. We're going to start at the most obvious place to start, 1973's self-titled debut, Queen, and the very first track. That's right, it's Keep Yourself Alive, written by Brian May, featuring Freddie Mercury on lead and backing vocals, Brian on electric and acoustic guitars, backing vocals, and a brief snippet of lead vocals, John Deacon on bass guitar, and Roger Taylor on drums, tambourine, backing vocals, and again, a brief lead vocal snippet. It was released as a single at the time, the UK, July 6th of 1973, in the US, sometime in October of 1973. Either country, it did not chart. It did not rank at all. It flopped pretty hardcore, to be honest with you, which is a story in and of itself. It was the very first thing that Brian did play to Freddie and Roger in 1970, and the very first thing the Queen recorded. And I say that when Brian played it to Freddie and Roger, this was, of course, coming from the ashes of the pre-Queen band Smile that Brian and Roger were in, with a man called Tim Staffel, who does come into play during this first album a bit. Tim Staffel was actually roommates with Freddie Mercury, and after introduced them, the band used to hang out all the time. Freddie used to come to all Smile's shows and vice versa. And when Tim left the band, Freddie kind of was the one who made sense to replace him to a degree. And this was the very first thing, like I said, played for the band. And of course, in a live setting, they used to play this track during the early days. They didn't have quite the catalog to pull from as it did in their later tours, so they pretty much played almost everything. The band played this track live in full for the most part. In 1981, they shortened it up by adding a drum solo, leading it to segue into the guitar solo. It did come back in 1984 as part of a medley. Queen was known for playing a lot of medleys of their tracks, little brief snippets from quick format to get as many hits in as possible. It did retire after 84 and 85. That was not played during the 86 final Queen tour with Freddie Mercury. Brian did not play at any of his solo shows. Roger, of course, didn't play at any of his solo shows. It was not part of the Queen and Paul Rogers project. Although Brian would occasionally throw the main riff into his solo during Queen and Paul Rogers, it was resurrected for the Queen and Adam Lambert tours. Now, personally, I always thought this was a great opener to the album. Again, being that I heard this much later on from when it actually existed, I'm seeing this from a different angle, different time. I thought this was a great intro to the band. It has the intro guitar that really gets you into a groove, never really lets up. You get to hear great vocals from all three singers, showcasing just what a vocal talent the band does have. And it really has it's a good showcase of where Queen was at this early stage of their existence. They're not quite at their full production best, their full studio best, or even their full live best, but the raw energy is there. And I'm going to invite you now to pause this podcast, go listen to the track, and then we can come back. When we're done, I'll be here to tell you my listening notes of the original album track from 1973. Go listen to it now. And okay, you're back. You listen to it? Great. All right, let's go talk about the original album version, the first one we're going to get into. I do love the long, slow burn intro. You hear that great on the rhythmic side, on the left-hand side of your headphones, and then this great funky feel as the guitar slides in on the right. Right away, you're in for something different. You're in for something rocking. It's also got a very subtle, moving bass line. This is the first time you'll hear me say it, but it won't be the last time you hear me say it. John Deacon was not known for a slap bass, very power bass. You're not going to hear much about him, but he was a very intelligent man. He was a very musical man. He knew when to use the bass, when to let it breathe, but he'd often find that he used his bass line as a great counterpoint to the melody or a great counterpoint to the guitar work being played. Every once in a while, he'd slide this little solo in or this moving bass line that really kind of added to the texture of the track. And if anything, Queen has great texture to their tracks. Of course, Freddie's voice is very young at this time. He's not quite the loud and charged and commanding presence that he'll become, but he's definitely got that raw energy. The drum sound, very canned. I'm not going to say if you don't like this drum sound, I get it. Roger Taylor gets it. The band gets it. The whole first album, they weren't very pleased with this drum sound. It was a point of contention throughout the recording. In fact, it railroaded a couple of tracks we'll hear about later on. But this one was definitely one that definitely showcased. The drumming was just not. The drumming itself was fine, but the sound of the drums really were a detriment. But it's interesting enough. first single the band introduces has a drum solo in it. Not many singles at the time would have a drum solo in the middle of the track, a little breakdown like that. But it's very cool that it showcases, again, the beginnings of the production, panning left to right, hearing the sound go all over the place. Queen was very known for using the space, using the sound of the headphone, the stereo sound. It would place different sounds in different spots, and it became almost another instrument in and of itself. They use it to jam with themselves and harmonize with themselves. It was a really great movie. This was a good opening track to showcase that. Um, One of the best parts about the track, the bridge section, which is the first time we get to hear Brian and Roger on lead vocals. Roger has a line, Brian answers the line, and then Freddie joins in again. You're gonna find that I'm a sucker for the time when the band sang together and when each of them had their own solo sections. I think that Freddie obviously is one of the greatest vocalists of all time. I think Roger Taylor could have been lead vocalist for many number of bands. Brian also is a solid, strong singer. He's more solid on the softer stuff than the more folksier stuff as he'll get on, but he is a great singer in and of itself. So you have three prominent vocalists. So I love getting to hear the different sounds, the different styles. Roger Taylor has a very Rod Stewart to him. Brian's got this very vulnerable voice. Freddie has this big, powerful, not necessarily Broadway style, not necessarily operatic, but almost all of them put together. It's great, again, texture, colorizing the song, and this is a good showcase to start that with. Of course, the ending of the song is a jam session. Some subtle changes as it fades out. Brian was also very noted for saying he never liked to repeat anything twice. Every time the verse repeated, he'd add a little something to it here, a little sound texture here, a note there, a melody here. And you can say that right here. As it goes at the end, he starts jamming out, changing things just a little subtly here and there as it goes. Now, a quote from Brian May that I read, I'm not sure where it was. I would credit if I could, and if it's from your magazine, let me know and I'll give you credit for it. Brian was quoted as saying, "I think of Keep Yourself Alive as the first proper Queen song. Unfortunately, apart from a few places like Japan, it didn't get much airplay. We were told it takes too long to happen, boys. It's more than half of a minute before you get to the first vocal. So when we made the second album, we thought, right, we'll show them. And when we get to that second album, you're going to hear more about that to a degree." And one other quote I got from Brian May, again, I'm not sure where the quote came from, but I wasn't very sure that I was a songwriter, I just sort of had this idea. Strangely enough, the lyrics of Keep Yourself Alive are meant to be a comment. They're meant to be slightly ironical. But I learned very on through this song, it's very difficult to be ironical in a song because people take it at face value. And basically, people always did think that Keep Yourself Alive was just a jolly song about how great it is to be alive. But it's actually more about asking the question, is there more to life than this, in a sense? Or is he saying, is this the real life? Or is this just fantasy? That's a different track. So let's break now into the alternatively released versions. These are versions that did get released somewhat officially, so we can definitely talk about them without getting into too much trouble. We had the Day Lane Lay demos, the US edit, the BBC session from February of 1973, the BBC session from July of 1973, and a track called The Long Lost Retake. Let's start with the Day Lane Lay demos. So in 1971, an acquaintance of Brian May's named Terry Eaton had opened up a studio in Wembley that was named Day Lane Lay, and he needed a band to test the equipment. And of course, at that time, the band couldn't afford to rent out studio time, so it was a match made in heaven in exchange for testing out the equipment, testing out some of the most state-of-the-art studio technology at the time. The band would be able to lay down a couple of tracks to shop around to get a record contract. And this was the first track that they laid down. In a BBC interview in 1983, Brian actually said it best. The first recording of it ever was in Day Lane Lay, where we did it ourselves, and I've still got that recording, and I think it's very good, and it's something which the single never had. But they pressurized us very strongly to redo all the tracks, and we redid Keep Yourself Alive with Roy Thomas Baker, and it was pretty awful, actually. I thought it was terrible, and I was very unhappy about it. I thought the Day Lane Lay one was better. I eventually managed to persuade Roy that it was better as well. So we went back in, did it again, in a way that was much more true to the original. But there's no way you can never ever really repeat something. I had this great belief that the magic of the moment can never be recaptured. And although we ended up with something that was technically in playing and perhaps even in the recording a bit better than the Day Lane Lay thing, I still think that the Day Lane Lay one had a certain sort of magic. So I was never really happy. As it turned out, no one else was really ever happy with it either. We kept remixing it. We thought that the mix was wrong. We kept remixing it, and there must have been at least 7 or 8 mixes by different groups of people. Eventually, we went in and did a mix with Mike Stone, our engineer, and that's the one we were in the end happiest with. That's the one that we put out. But to my mind, Keep Yourself Alive was never really satisfactory. Never had that magic that it should have had. Going into it, It is a very different style of track. There's an acoustic guitar that starts out the original chugga chugga chug part. On the left hand opening, there's the acoustic guitar on the left and this raw sounding guitar on the right. They still were working on panning, they were still working on space, but it was the texture of it and the almost like that electric buzz to it that the album version just didn't have. Also, to mention, quite frankly, the drum sounds better than the album version. This raw drum power, it was so much more what Roger Taylor was going for. It's a shame that they were never able to kind of reproduce this kind of sound for the album. And with that being said, the drum solo was so much more powerful in this one. The drum solo and the breakdown just comes across exactly how Roger wanted it to sound. Never was quite recaptured in their attempts for the first album. I got some Freddie ad-libs and woohoos there that were actually felt more like the live version they would later on do. But speaking of Freddie, his voice isn't quite as sharp then, but there's still that raw energy to it as well. The energy seems a little bit higher. There are harmonies there that are not quite as extravagant, but definitely the groundwork is there for what we would come to find in the Queen album track. The bridge is there, it's the same, and the slightly less developed lyrics, of course, obviously things change a little bit here and there, but overall they are pretty much the same as you would find in the album track. Overall, though, it is a very, very cool track, and if you can definitely get a chance to take a listen to that, I would do so. Moving on to the next version, it's the US edit. Now, this was released on vinyl in the US. It's basically the single version of Keep Yourself Alive, and all it really is an early fade out of the song, probably about 15 to 17 seconds. Interestingly enough, this is also the version found on the original United States version of Greatest Hits. But moving on, nothing more to say about that. Go to the BBC sessions. First, they had February of 1973, and then July of 1973. Neither are really essential listening. They're both eventually released on the double Queen On Air album that was released, basically collecting all the BBC sessions. Most of the time, especially in the early years, the Queen would basically take the album version, the album backing track, or as what was the track at the time, maybe a slightly different mix, and use that and just throw in a different vocal on top. They might have Brian playing a little bit extra guitar on top. It wasn't really more of an actual retake of the track. It was kind of just more of like a slightly different mix almost, a few extra versions of it. Both of them were similar. The February 1973 one, I would say, was recorded in Langham 1 in 1973. It basically had a backing track, might have been slowed a little bit. The bass seems a little quieter in the mix, maybe it wasn't quite as brought up for the album as with the album version. There's a couple alternative Freddie vocal takes in there, a little bit rawer, a few more of the Day Lane Lay or the live-like ad-libs he threw in there. The one different thing, there was a cool vocal harmony just before and after the bridge. Kind of a weird Roger Taylor double track. I went from a double track down to a single track and then back up to a double track. If you don't know what I mean by double track, is the band a lot of times would take a single line, sing it, then sing the exact same line on top of it, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times to create a big, large sound on one line. It sounds really cool. It's a really cool take they used to do all the time. Freddie was actually most known for that. Brian used to say Freddie could sing back a track or a line on a track multiple times and have the exact same pitch, so it had this weird harmonic thing that really added to the overall sound. It became a calling card of sorts. The July version, of course, recorded a few months later. The mix was a little bit more advanced. Still similar, and actually the backing track seems at a normal speed again. There is another alternative vocal, better than the first BBC take, but not quite as crisp as the album version. There are some ad-libs again, and those are always fun to listen to. But again, neither of them are really what I would call essential listening. And finally, we come to the long-lost retake. Eventually, it was released in 1991 when the Hollywood Records, the North American record company for Queen, had just acquired the Queen catalog. They released all the albums on CD, and they had bonus tracks that were released. Most of them, honestly, were crappy, like dance remixes, and I don't know why they went that route. There was so much stuff in the vault they could have given us as bonuses. But there was a few gems that did sneak out, and this was one of them. Now, this version of Keep Yourself Alive was recorded in 1975, after the studio suggested perhaps re-releasing it after since it wasn't successful the first time through. The band got a little more successful with Seven Seas of Rhye, then Killer Queen. They got successful with their live shows. They said, maybe we should give this one another shot rather. So they decided to re-record it instead of putting out the old track. Let's get it more like the live take, more like the live versions we've been doing. And they basically did that. But for whatever reason, the band, or the studio rather, decided not to use this version and ended up just releasing the original, and well, it didn't do very much on the charts then either. But I'm glad it happened because, frankly, this is a great version. This is a very energetic version. It's as much like the live version that had developed at the time. And if you listen to the live versions from Hammersmith and Rainbow, you see where it comes in. This has got a great drum sound now. They really perfected their drums. The vocals are very raw but very powerful. The harmonies are perfected. The drum solo is one of my favorites. It's a shorter one, but it's still got this really driving power to it. I will say they didn't use as much of the studio space like they do as far as like the stereo sounds, I should say. Not as much panning, not as much here or there or everywhere. It's basically like they plugged in, blew it live, and then just added some harmonies afterwards. It's not all like that. There is some panning and drum solo in the bridge, but overall it's definitely more of a live feel to it. That's basically if I could say one thing about it, it just sounds like it's live in the studio. But it's great to hear in the bridge that Roger and Brian's vocals are more confident, more stronger. But this is definitely an exciting version. If you ever hear this, it was also released on the 2011 Island Records reissue of the Queen catalog, this time on the deluxe version of the Night at the Opera soundtrack, given that it was recorded again in 1975 during those sessions. And with that, we're going to move on to the unreleased versions. These are versions not officially released, but were somehow leaked through bootlegs and through collectors, things of that nature. We do at first have the Long Lost Retake edit. Basically, this would be the B-side of what the Long Lost Retake single would have been. Also kind of jokingly known as the Short Lost Retake. It's still unreleased. About 30 seconds have been edited down. It's an earlier fade out. The intro's cut down. Some bits around the drum solo are edited. Really unessential listening overall. If you've heard the Long Lost Retake, there's no reason to seek this out. The next is the Trident Studios early version, which was but leaked out. An alternative take that originated from a 12-inch acetate of the first Queen album. This is one of those early versions that Brian May was talking about. It shows the progression from the Day Lane Lay version towards the final album version. This is one that Brian thought was awful, produced by Roy Thomas Baker. It is very overproduced, but you know what? I'm glad it got leaked because I like hearing the alternative versions of it. There's definitely some alternate energy there. There's a really prominent bass line there. It's one thing I will say. It's loud and proud, much more than John Deacon usually gets. It does shift a lot between the acoustic guitars and electric guitars, especially during the intros. It's not really as cohesive. There's some really jarring sounds to it, especially specifically when they move to the drum solo. It's a very muddy sound, and overall, I can get why Brian didn't like it, especially compared to Day Lane Lay, and also compared to the album version, which is what we got. I definitely prefer to the other versions over this one, although again, nice to hear an alternate version. Finally, we got the withdrawn UK 7-inch promo mix. This was originally the single mix, which was released on June 15th, 1973. Unfortunately, it was discovered real quickly that the single had a wrong mix of the song. So quickly, the incorrect pressings were taken back from DJs, presumably supposed to be destroyed, although obviously some of them were kept. And after it was corrected, the single was re-released in July 6th of 1973. There's not much really difference to it. I've heard it. It basically just seems unmixed. Seems like the left side of the stereo version was just louder than the right side. But it sounds like the musical takes themselves are still the same to the final version as the final version. There's really not much to listen to there. Next up, we got the unreleased and unheard versions. This is basically where we get into speculation here, or things that have been talked about but have not leaked amongst the common collectors, or maybe some of the more super collectors have them. I have not heard them. As far as For Keep Yourself Alive goes, we do know about the different takes and versions that existed according to Brian. Somewhere between the Day Lane Lane and the final version, there were, again, 8 different takes. They still exist. Who knows? I know Brian was very particular about keeping tracks in his archives. A lot of things that have come to light are because he liked to keep every version of things. But at the same time, back in this day, especially the early era, the band might have just have to record over it to save money, to save tape. So who knows if they're still out there. If they are, it'd be kind of cool to hear more of progression, but who knows. Now moving on finally to the live versions, the officially released live versions. The band had a bunch of them on this one because, again, a lot of the early concerts they wanted to play more of the tracks. We had Live at the Rainbow, double album. They had 2 versions, one from March of 74, one from November of 74. Also Live at Hammersmith, December of 1975. The Live Killers version, which was the first official released live album by the band. And then finally the Rock Montreal version. Now basically, Live Killers was the one that was released first. Much like the first album, this is actually an album that the band is not very fond of. Roger doesn't like the sound of it. He basically disowns it. The funny thing about Live Killers is It's taken from the Live Killers tour, but instead of choosing like one venue as a representative or even taking tracks from different venues along the tour, they'd actually go so far as to take snippets of tracks from different venues and hodgepodge them together. What I mean by that is basically, for example, in the song "Death on Two Legs," which we'll come to later on, the first 3 minutes and 25 seconds were from Barcelona on February 20th of 1979, whereas from 3 minutes and 25 seconds to 3 minutes and 33 seconds, it's from Frankfurt from February 2nd of 1979. I know of a great website called queenlive.ca by a friend of mine named Bob Wegner, which basically delves into where the tracks come from or what parts of the track come from. It's really good. They don't have everything on there. Some of them are unknown, but basically they took a look at bootlegs that have been released from the time and compared and contrast. It's really well done. It's very impressive. And that's basically what they did. But Keep Yourself Alive was taken from an unknown venue. No bootlegs ever really matched up. So we don't really know how much of it is from one venue or if it's from multiple venues. Never really find out. I will say, though, Live Killers was a very energetic version, but I think Hammersmith was my favorite of the early years. You can definitely see a progression. There's definitely some high energy. There's definitely some more power as it goes on. Later on, the band gets more confident in themselves. Speaking of confidence, it's interesting to note that live versions of the song, during the bridge section, Roger would sing his line. Freddie would always sing along with Brian during the bridge, during his line. Brian was notorious for not being very confident in lead singing live. Even when he did his first solo tour, he was noted for being a little nervous about being the lead vocalist. So Freddie usually backed him up in a way. So you'd hear Roger singing, then Freddie singing. It's pretty cool to hear, though, still. Finally, the Rock Montreal version is what I like a lot because it includes a snippet of a jam, which was an unrecorded song. It's called either Sex Show, perhaps Shag It Out. It's a very funky song it begins with and then kind of grooves right into Keep Yourself Alive. But unfortunately, that one goes into a long drums timpani solo and out to the guitar, so you don't really get the full track, unfortunately. So for the ultimate version, I'd say Hammersmith 1975 from Live at the Odeon is the one to go to. Rock Montreal also is very fun to listen to. Now, alternatively unreleased live, Queen and Paul Rodgers never played the track live, but in Chile, for example, Brian did throw the riff into his guitar solo. He did that a couple of times throughout the tour. You just hear the beginning riff for it there. And finally, Queen and Adam Lambert did bring it back. It made sense to bring it back because the band was rediscovering their early years during the tours with Adam Lambert. Adam's tape is very different from Freddie here. You're going to find as we go on, I'll compare Freddie and Paul and Freddie and Adam, what they did with the different songs. Adam's definitely much more of a theatrical person, very much more a campy person, a very much more popular version. And this is the case where, in general, Adam does a good job with Queen tracks, and unlike Paul, did allow them to do the full catalog. But it's here where Freddie definitely outshines Adam. Freddie has a much more dangerous rock and roll feel. So when the more rock and roll tracks happen, Freddie definitively outshines Adam. But from that being said, this is still fine. This is still fun. Adam does a big glory note ending throughout it. I got to see it live. It was very fun. So that is all the tracks, all the takes, all of the live versions that were released. So now we come down to the end. We got to rate the track and then rank the track, the versions, and finally come up with an official crown jewel. My rating of this track out of 11, because we always turn it up to 11 here at PLD Projects. I give this track a solid 8.5. Like I said in the beginning of the podcast, a very energetic opening, a very good introduction to who Queen was, all about their rock and roll essence, but a lot of great productive sound and everything else to it. There are a couple tracks I like better on this album and throughout their career, but this is a solid opening. So here we are with the rankings. From least favorite to the crown jewel, we got the Trident version on the bottom, BBC Session July 1973, BB Session February of 1973. The album version, Live at the Odeon / Live Killers, I'll give those a tie. The Day Lane Laid demo, Live at the Rainbow March of 1974. Rock Montreal only gets slighted because it's not the full version of the song. Live at the Rainbow November of 1974. And finally, the crown jewel, the one I will be putting in my playlist, the PLD Crown Jewels playlist, the long lost retake from 1975. And there you have it, folks. So that is the very first episode of Crown Jewels. I hope you enjoyed this little journey through Keep Yourself Alive, and I hope you'll come back next time as we tackle Doing All Right, track 2 on the 1973 self-titled debut album. Now, if you look in the description of this podcast, I'll tell you which albums you can find the different versions of. Perhaps even leave some YouTube links. I'll also leave in my Patreon link, patreon.com/PLDprojects, which should be going live in February of 2022. I hope you'll leave me a like, maybe a review. Talk to me what you'd like to see more from this, less from this, what you liked, what you didn't like. Or you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Denuzio or at PLD Projects. And you can also find more of my podcast days, myself and PJ Campbell doing two mediocre white dudes on films. We take looks at horror franchises and their franchises as we see fit. And on YouTube at PLD Projects every Monday at 12:30 Pacific. I do a show called Scoundrels with a bunch of buddies, Matty Gunner and Richard Eric Jarvie, and we talk movie news and get into some sweaty details about nerd genres, things of that nature. That's it for now. I hope you come back next time. Take care, guys. God save the Queen.